Hello, world. Welcome to Cans of Corn. This is the Colonel Corn, your host with the most, and today we have Axel back. Say hi. You want to
Hi,
introduce yourself?
I'm Axel Fair-Schulz. I think some of you may remember me from the last two times I've been on. I'm a history professor at the State University of New York in Potsdam, not in Germany, but in upstate New York in the United States, where it is freezing at the moment. And today I want to talk a little more about Erich Fromm and his world, which was to a large extent the world of the Cold War, the world of the 20th century, but I also want to talk a little bit about our world today, which I think can be adequately described as a world on fire.
Yes, Erich Fromm, the Cold War and the World on Fire. That's right. That's going to be our topic today. We already talked about my good old man, Erich Fromm. Um, this is the second part. Maybe some of you already saw the first. Today, I was thinking to myself under the shower, which is always dangerous because you develop interesting ideas. At least that's the case with me. And I think there is something still to explore with the fact that Fromm really thought we come to this world with a soul, and there's something about us that uh, eludes the scientific method that is still out there. That is one of the maybe we can call it the known unknowns, and if we would, I don't know, maybe know more about that, then a few things in this horrific world might probably change instantly. This materialist bullshit doesn't even matter. Is it Stalinism? Is it capitalism? They all have their materialist attitude. That this, if you will, mm, individualistic, liberal, bourgeois, materialist habit, we just take as granted, just as the water or the sunlight. So that's a random thought for you to get the show started with. Uh, what do you think?
Yes, I think that's a very good way of approaching Erich Fromm. He saw himself as a socialist humanist, and humanists put human beings at the very center of everything. Not in terms of what some have called species narcissism, as in, arguing that humans are unique and above all other beings, but humans, as in, they should be an end in and of themselves, as opposed to means to some other end. And Erich Fromm very much advocated for a society where the happiness of human beings collectively and individually should be at the center of everything. So, in our world today, where violence and war is, so normalized, I think we had a conversation just a few minutes ago before we went on air about yet another ice shooting. We see this absolutely, mind-boggling violence toward immigrants, toward marginalized people, toward anyone who does not fit into the mold of what those in power, who those in power approve of. All of that was absolutely hateful to Erich Fromm. So, in the world of violence and war, not just war against people, but also war on education and culture, because we live at a day and age when universities are being defunded, when cultural institutions are being attacked, when their very, purpose is being reframed. Just recently we saw the renaming of the Kennedy Center into the Trump Kennedy Center, where, the focus is obviously not the promotion of any kind of art and culture any longer, but the worshiping of individuals and the self-aggrandizement of those individuals. So all of that really emphasizes how important and useful it is to take a look at Erich Fromm again today.
Yeah, that's true. That's so true. I don't really have much to add to that, except maybe two things. Um, Interesting that Trump is building his monument in this way, uh, also using state violence in a kind of monumental way. That's just actionism, just presence, and totally going against the grain, against local government, against essentially people. So that's interesting, interesting little side note. So general strikes might be on the table, and there could be this could be the long year in which we got rid of empire. Who knows? I mean, this can be over pretty quick when the people realize, oh wait, we've got the power. We can do general strikes. We can take our country back, just as this seriously troubled dude promised, and then delivered the So that's one thing. The other thing is this thing with immigrants. I think it would be especially helpful to look at all this at this essentially it's a narrative that's been given to us, immigration being a problem for markets. Even communists have their weird takes on immigration when you think, how can that be possible when there's something like a human right to freedom of movement, and any Marxist who is really seriously interested to explore Karl Marx's idea of humanism and developing a new human, Marxist human, get it out of this iron grip of liberalism, then going along with laws and regulations of immigrations as as a way to essentially exploit labor and worker power is a pretty dumb move in my book. So, um, but there you go. It's in a way that they managed to normalize this entire dialogue. Um, you have to really unpack a lot when you talk with uh, normies about immigration and immigration laws and the right and the left and who has the better solution. It's essentially all bullshit. Two sides of the coin. It's a giant lie. It's a massive distraction. They all know they need cheap labor keep their shit afloat. So what's really going on here in this level of self-deception? Um,
Absolutely. I think that is one of the reasons why it, is still very important to take a look at Erich Fromm's perspective,
right.
not just on Western capitalism, but on Eastern so-called real existing socialism as well. So what I want to do today a little bit is to deal with the question of what did Fromm have to say about the Soviet bloc,
Mhm.
and why do his views on the Soviet bloc still matter today? And I think one major aspect of that is the insight formulated by Rosa Luxemburg, and we talked about Rosa Luxemburg just about a week ago, that there cannot be any kind of socialism, meaningful, real socialism, without democracy, and there cannot be any kind of democracy without socialism. And that is a position and an insight that Erich Fromm very much internalized as well. To Erich Fromm, socialism means human beings becoming the masters of their own destiny. It means them not being controlled by anyone else, but controlling themselves. It means developing and deepening democracy. So socialism and democracy were deeply connected. So when Fromm looks at the Soviet bloc, he asks himself, to what extent are the people who live inside the Soviet bloc really in charge of their own destiny? Are they able to control, or were they able to control their own fate? Fromm, of course, did not experience the end of the Soviet system. He died in 1980. We know how it all ended, and he was convinced, of course, that things could not continue the way they were developing indefinitely, and the same applies to Western capitalism. He regarded both systems as deeply problematic because he saw at the very core of them what he called managerialism, meaning a type of society where a small, relatively small group of individuals were in charge and controlled the majority of the population. And it didn't really matter that much at the end what kind of rhetoric they used to justify their rule, whether they used the rhetoric of the Enlightenment and of socialism, or whether they use the rhetoric of the Enlightenment and liberalism and freedom and democracy and so on and so forth. What really mattered was what actually happened to flesh and blood human beings. So understanding the significance of democracy as a key component of socialism is one of the reasons why Fromm remains relevant. Then there is right now this, I think, somewhat troublesome development of at least partial rehabilitation of Stalinism. I don't know whether that is a phenomenon of equal strength in Germany as well. My suspicion is it probably is not quite as pronounced. But in the English-speaking world, especially in the United States, there is among a certain segment of the left a new infatuation with Stalinism, along the lines of, well, Stalin was not so bad, and what happened during the Stalin era was perhaps, necessary, and, certain things have been exaggerated, and so on and so forth. So, reading from I think is very useful in this situation to fortify ourselves against any any false nostalgia. Fromm was very critical not just of the Soviet Union under Stalin, but of the Soviet system after the process of formal de-Stalinization took place, after 1956 and the Khrushchev era, the so-called thaw, and so on and so forth. Fromm was very happy, obviously, that the most gruesome horrors of the Stalin age ended. In terms of the mass incarcerations, in terms of the show trials, in terms of all the mass shootings, and so on and so forth. But he believed that de-Stalinization did not go far enough, and the deeper structures of Stalinism remained intact even during the Khrushchev and later on the Brezhnev eras. So Fromm remains very much, a catalyst for us to not become, overly accommodating or nostalgic as far as the Stalin era is concerned, and to romanticize real existing socialism. At the same time, Fromm also did not demonize the Soviet system. And I think that is very important, because that was what Cold War liberals have done and continue to do. So being very critical of the Soviet Union, even the Soviet Union, after the death of Stalin in 1953, does not mean one should look at the Eastern European states as the incarnation of the most horrible dictatorships imaginable. One should instead look at the real accomplishments of those countries, look at what they accomplished, for example, in terms of making education more accessible to broader layers of people who previously were excluded from being able to go to universities. And I think that is something that North Americans can perhaps appreciate more, because here in the US, people have to pay in order to go to university. They have to pay tuition. And that often means they will end up in cycles of debt that will be very difficult, if not impossible, to pay back. People go to university. When they graduate, they will be $100,000, $150,000 or more in debt. And then it will take decades for them to ever pay back their student loans. So access to university education was something that these so-called socialist states guaranteed in ways that was unheard of before. So Fromm was mindful of the real accomplishments in terms of social programs and so on and so forth, but he also remained very critical as far as the so-called democracy deficit was concerned. There's actually an interesting book by Katja Heuer. I think you may have heard of it. It's called Beyond the Wall, A History of East Germany. And this book is sort of an antidote to those efforts to just, one-dimensionally look at East Germany, for example, as a dictatorship, while the lived experience of East Germans was often much more complex and nuanced. And Fromm was aware of that. So Fromm advocated a more nuanced perspective, looking at the Soviet system as a mixed bag, On the one hand, he understood that it was not what it advertised itself to be. It was not really a socialist society. It was not actual, real existing socialism. On the other hand, it was also more than just a dictatorship. It was a society that offered people things such as free healthcare, considerable social programs, and a safety net. And thus, what Fromm wants us to do, even though he is dead, his books still challenge us, is to arrive at a more complex understanding of these societies, while realizing, of course, that ultimately what developed on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain was as inadequate as what developed on the western side of the Iron Curtain.
Mm-hmm. Especially today, there's something haunting about thinking about the Stasi, the Secret Service who would spy on people, knowing about Palantir and about the privatization of spying on people in order to blackmail or however exploit the information you've gained by using those tools, and then watching government agency that's funded like a little state, this ice monster, shooting people who fled to the States while thinking about the people standing on the wall of the former Eastern German Republic, shooting people who were trying to flee. So there's something about Stalinism that's also in capitalism, in this police state we've created after waging a war on terror and essentially perfecting Rousseau's method, Rousseau's outlook into the world, this wildling that's about to get us because we are so weak. But we are the bourgeoisie and we can just overrun them and take control over all those whitelings to make them civilized. And then, I mean, there's something in this psychology that's just seriously fucked up. I just wish there were more people, we had more conversations like this, talking about Fromm, who was a psychologist, who came out of therapy, talking with people, working with people, watching this madness of positivism unfold. And he probably knew all that already. So what happened the last, I don't know, 40 years? Not much.
Yeah, Fromm uses two categories, necrophilia versus biophilia.
Mm-hmm.
Necrophilia essentially is sort of a love of death, and biophilia a love of life. And if he were alive today, he would argue that what we see in terms of Trumpism, what we see not just in terms of Trumpism, but also in terms of what largely opened the door for Trumpism, neoliberal capitalism, is a manifestation of necrophilia, a manifestation of a cult of death, which essentially is the proclivity to worship power, to worship conquest, domination, looking at human beings only as means to an end, the end being profit maximization. And the alternative to that was, to him, a real democratic socialist society where everyone would have the opportunity for a good life, to develop their innate human potential, their talents, their interests, and all of that to unfold in a way that, no one would be oppressed, no one would be dominated, and people would be able to work together in solidarity. Now, Fromm was not naive. He did not think this would happen automatically and seamlessly and without any kind of struggle. And he often had a fairly pessimistic outlook, where he thought maybe the tendency of necrophilia, the love of death, would ultimately prove to be stronger than biophilia. But even when, as I pointed out last time, when he was at his most pessimistic, he wanted to be an optimist, an optimistic pessimist. He hoped that by describing our situation in very realistic terms and pointing out the odds we are struggling against, humanity would ultimately make an effort to overcome its more dangerous instincts. And what he meant with that was this destructive tendency that we have inside of ourselves and that societies have built into them, in particular capitalism, but also the former Eastern Bloc. And I want to very briefly read an actual quote by Erich Fromm. It's from one of his books written in the early 1960s. So it reflects his thinking from the 1950s, from the late 1950s, during the high point of the Cold War. The book is called May Men Prevail? An Inquiry into the Facts and Fictions of Foreign Policy. And in this book, he reflects on the nature of the Soviet system. And he looks at the Soviet Union, first of all, as a hope that failed. So he very much identifies with the Bolshevik project, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. He believes what the Bolsheviks wanted was to create a free and democratic society. And he believes their experiment went wrong. And there are specific reasons for why it went wrong. But the fact that this experiment went wrong does not invalidate the original intentions, the goals and objectives of this experiment. So he describes the Soviet system, quote, "It changed from a revolutionary system considering itself the center and promoter of communist revolutions in Europe and eventually throughout the world, into a conservative industrial class society run along the lines in many respects similar to the development of capitalist states in the West." And that sort of connects with what you were alluding to earlier, that what we have seen in the Soviet bloc with the Stasi, for example, the East German secret police, all of that should remind us of similar institutions in the West. And when we look at our world today, I think even the most dogmatic and militant and Stalinistic Stasi generals would be green with envy if they would see, what is available to the NSA and the various coercive organizations today. They could only have dreamt of such possibilities of control. Now, I don't want to justify what the Stasi did, but I think it is important to understand the historical context to some extent, and that is East Germany was a very small state at the frontier of the Cold War, meaning it was right at the fault line between East and West. And the West was determined to annihilate the East. So East Germany was preoccupied, overly preoccupied with security. It was a paranoid police state, no doubt. But it also was threatened. It had real enemies, and the West did not spare any expenses in trying to destabilize East Germany. So again, this does not justify the overreach of the Stasi, but there is a context to it, just as there is a context to the rise of Stalinism in the Soviet Union. The Stalinist police state did not come into existence suddenly and without reason, but because there was a civil war, there was a situation where the Bolsheviks were besieged on all sides, where 14 foreign armies invaded Soviet Russia. And, the history of the rise of Stalinism is quite complicated. Again, none of that excuses any of the crimes committed under Stalinism, but I think it is important to understand the immense pressure these socialist experiments were under, and how those pressures push them into a more authoritarian direction than they would have developed under more positive circumstances.
Yeah, that's a way to put it. I think it's also, yeah, no, I really can just agree with you. Uh, just a random thought again with the ice, which is just the Stasi returning as a farce, history repeating itself, and it repeats itself as a farce a second time. So
A very brutal farce, of
Stasi
course.
was the real thing, developed under this real external pressure of the Western Bloc, if you will. You call the Eastern Bloc the Eastern. There was also the Western Bloc. It was very blocky, like playing Tetris, just shifting blocks along. So they were, in a sense, justified, if you want. Stalin has his history developed out of this war with fucking Hitler and the Nazis. And when you know about their crimes, then yeah, so relativism is a thing that erodes a lot right there and puts things into context. And that's what we want to do. And it makes it's worth to think about it and to think things through. Then, I mean, if people did that before, then we wouldn't be in this position to talk about another murder at the hand of ICE. This is
Absolutely.
this is all connected, as I used to say in my better days.
Absolutely. Well, what I find intriguing about Fromm, and not just Fromm, of course, but Fromm is a good example, is that while, when you read his books, there's quite a bit of abstract philosophical analysis and musings and speculation, but there also is a great deal of empirical material there, as you pointed out, and as we pointed out earlier. Fromm was a practicing psychoanalyst, so he was able to draw on concrete experiences with his patients. When he writes about human nature, he's not just thinking about human nature in terms of abstract ideas, either his own abstract ideas or the abstract ideas of other psychologists and philosophers. He is drawing on the concrete examples of his patients. When it comes to the Eastern Bloc, Fromm had actual experiences with the Eastern Bloc, even though he lived in the West, obviously. He did have a relative, a distant cousin. His name was Heinz Brandt. And Heinz Brandt lived in East Germany. He was a loyal communist, which meant he was a Stalinist, not in terms of approving of all the crimes of Stalin. Most people during the Stalin era itself had no idea of the actual extent of what really happened inside of the Soviet Union. So Heinz Brandt was a loyal member of the East German Communist Party, the so-called SED, the Socialist Unity Party. To provide a little bit of context, that party came into existence in 1946 when the German Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party on East German soil were, when they unified, when they emerged into one party. That unification was not entirely voluntary. It was essentially a unification under the auspices of the Communist Party. So the Social Democratic Party was absorbed into the Communist Party in East Germany. In any event, to make a long story short, Heinz Brandt was a member of the party and at the same time an idealist, like so many other communists. And at some point, he became disillusioned and he decided he could not get along with things in East Germany any longer. So he left East Germany. That was before the wall was built in 1961. So he left for the West, and in West Germany, he became a prominent union organizer and also a prominent critic of East Germany. He remained loyal to his socialist convictions, but he called out East Germany on its human rights violations. What happened next is something that should be deeply disturbing to anyone who takes socialist and communist ideas seriously. Essentially, the East German Stasi kidnapped him. They kidnapped Heinz Brandt, I believe, in West Berlin, and took him to East Berlin. They took him across the border and imprisoned him in East Germany. So we're talking about, a very obvious violation of fundamental human rights. Their argument was that, he was an East German citizen, once an East German citizen, always an East German citizen, and thus they had the right to, quote, bring him to justice for having betrayed East Germany. In any event, because he was a distant cousin of Fromm, Fromm eventually got involved, and he tried to get him out of prison and eventually make it possible for Heinz Brandt to return to the West, where his wife lived as well at that point. but East Germany was unwilling to do that. Fromm advocated for him for quite a while. Erich Fromm was also, and I don't know whether we have mentioned that or not, instrumental in the creation of Amnesty International. And as we've pointed out before, Fromm was both an idealist and fairly pragmatic. So he tried to find ways of helping his cousin by talking to lots of different people, including using his connections with Amnesty International. And it was decided that Amnesty International would make Heinz Brandt their prisoner of the year or something like that, which made the case of Heinz Brandt very prominent. So East Germany was put into a complicated situation. They did not want to be embarrassed. Fromm put a lot of pressure on East Germany to release Heinz Brandt from prison, but East Germany was at some point willing to release Heinz Brandt from prison, but their condition was Heinz Brandt would have to stay in East Germany. He would have to recant publicly, apologize for his supposed betrayal, having gone to the West and criticized East Germany publicly. So Fromm continued to advocate, and it was a stalemate to some extent, but eventually Fromm communicated with Bertrand Russell, who was a famous liberal pacifist, once upon a time a fairly dogmatic anti-communist at the very beginning of the Cold War, but by the 1950s he became very critical of Western anti-communism as well and advocated for peaceful coexistence. So Bertrand Russell established himself as a worldwide, globally known voice for peaceful coexistence. And the Soviet Union actually developed positive relations with Bertrand Russell. Khrushchev befriended him. And ultimately, because Erich Fromm lobbied Bertrand Russell on behalf of his cousin Heinrich Brandt, East Germany was unwilling to do anything beyond freeing Brandt, but not letting him go to the West. Bertrand Russell, instructed by Fromm to do so, approached Khrushchev. And Khrushchev did not want to endanger his relationship with Bertrand Russell for PR purposes. So Khrushchev ultimately said, yes, for the sake of keeping my public relationship and friendship with Bertrand Russell, let's tell those East Germans that they should release Heinz Brandt and allow him to return to the West. So Fromm did use his connections, his friendships with various people, including Bertrand Russell, to help his cousin. So he was quite savvy in playing the game of international human rights diplomacy. And at the same time, this really gave him personal insights into how East Germany worked. You know, the true nature of real existing socialism. So he had no illusions about what East Germany and the Soviet Union were. So he looked at them as managerial societies, as authoritarian societies, and he concluded, despite their socialist rhetoric, they look at human beings much the same way as Western capitalist societies look at human beings, as means to an end, as opposed to an end in and of themselves. And to Fromm, that was fundamentally irreconcilable with what socialism really meant, putting human beings, real flesh and blood human beings, at the center of everything.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Also for this little anecdote, this side note with his cousin, Mr. Brand Maduro, who got kidnapped by the USA for dealing too much cocaine. No way.
Yes.
That was another story.
So
It's
kidnappings
coming to
apparently were neither Western nor
justice.
an Eastern
The
privilege.
justice of
They
the
both did it.
German
Yes.
Republic has to prevail. That's funny. That's so funny.
Yeah, and Fromm reminds us that, either we have certain principles or we don't have these principles. And if we have these principles, then certain things are absolutely unacceptable, including the kidnapping of people, even if we do it in the name of national security. And again, in all fairness, East Germany was no one is justified in kidnapping people, but East Germany could legitimately feel far more threatened than the United States. It's absolutely grotesque for the US to say credibly that it felt threatened by Venezuela in any fashion. But the same applies to the East German state. You cannot kidnap people, no matter what kinds of justifications you might put up. And Fromm's defense of democratic socialism, I think, is very important in that regard. When we talk about socialism as an alternative to capitalism, we have to explain why it is an alternative and what we're prepared to do in the name of socialism and what we're not prepared to do in the name of socialism. And to Fromm, this was a deeply moral question. But again, Fromm is not just a pie-in-the-sky idealist. He knows how the real world operated. He was able to negotiate, to talk to some very powerful people, and he tried to combine both, living in the real world and making some necessary compromises that are required in order to survive in the real world, while also drawing lines in the sand in terms of where our principles are and what principles cannot be compromised.
Yeah. With that comes, for me at least, the sense of humility that's always served me well. Just leave it with that. Do we have anything else?
Well, yeah, well, what I would like to bring up perhaps is Fromm's reflections on literature and culture in the Eastern Bloc. Because, Fromm has done many things right, but he was, of course, not perfect. And I think, as far as this particular book that I've mentioned before is concerned, May Men Prevail, an inquiry into the facts and fictions of foreign policy. I think Fromm did a very good job analyzing the Cold War, the reasons for the Cold War, the nature of the West, the nature of the East, and so on and so forth. And he provides lots of specifics, but sometimes he is also a little sweeping. For example, when it comes to his analysis of literature in the Eastern Bloc. And again, no one can do everything in a single book. And the book does not focus on Soviet culture or culture in East Germany or anything of that nature. But he argues that one troublesome aspect in the Soviet system beyond the end of real Stalinism with the death of Stalin was the low quality of literature. And I think, as someone who grew up in East Germany, I think that is to some extent correct in terms of much of the officially approved literature. Socialist realism, whether it is in something, in the visual arts or in terms of architecture or in terms of literature and poetry, could be quite formulaic and dogmatic. But at the same time, I think Fromm, as I said, is a little too sweeping. He first of all, does not provide specific examples. It would have been good if he had looked at some, Stalinist writers and explained in some detail what makes them so problematic. One aspect of Stalinist literature was, for example, that it had to follow certain formulas. For example, the party. In every piece of literature, the party had to play a key role. The party had to be the main instrument of progress. So no matter what the subject matter was dealt with, ultimately there had to be some political lesson with the party as the progressive force, as the positive force, and all of that was presented in very one-dimensional and didactic and propagandistic terms. But East German literature and Soviet literature was more than just this kind of propaganda. There were far more interesting writers, and I want to perhaps point to some writers from East Germany, Christa Wolf, for example. She will, in her books such as Divided Heaven or Cassandra and many of her other novels, think about the contradictions of life in East Germany in a fairly nuanced fashion. And Fromm did not really take notice of these types of developments. And I have to say, I was a little disappointed. I thought, given his familiarity with his cousin, Heinz Brandt, that perhaps Fromm would have, followed some of those literary developments in more detail. And Fromm did to some extent. Last time, I think we pointed out that he read the works of one of East Germany's eco-socialists, Wolfgang Harich, and commented on how Harich is one of the few thinkers on the other side of the Iron Curtain who is critical of economic growth for the sake of economic growth. But it would have been good if Fromm had, it would have been useful if Fromm had followed this up a little bit and read Soviet writers perhaps, or read them with more care. So what I'm trying to say is we should not idealize Fromm either. Fromm's critique is very insightful and still very relevant, but it's not a perfect critique. What he has to say about literature is a little too sweeping, and he makes some interesting points even when he is sweeping. For example, he engages the question of classical literature. He says, well, of course, in the Soviet Union, the works of 19th century Russian writers, as well as American writers and French writers, were available in inexpensive and large editions. But he argues that does not really mean it's part of a vibrant cultural sphere, because these books were written in a place far away from the Soviet Union, often in a different century, in a context that is very different, and thus they amounted to what he calls high-class escape literature. And I think that's interesting, right? So reading Tolstoy in the 1960s in the Soviet Union, reading the novels of Tolstoy written in the late 19th century, does that amount to high-class escape literature? I think it can in many ways. But at the same time, it can also lead readers to engage and confront their own reality in a deeper way. So I think here Fromm is perhaps a little too sweeping. But even when he's sweeping, it's an interesting observation, looking at it as high-class escape literature.
The pitfalls of propaganda, huh? There's always a second side to this. The one Fromm didn't really get to there, and in that way, I would agree with you. That's also true. The human creativity, and especially rebels, they find their way to circumvent doctrine, propaganda, whatever tools of power, whatever tools power wages against the poets. And there's some weird blooming going on when you circumvent the shit by also fitting into it. Like in that example, talking about the party, having the party solve the entire mess, but you still find ways to put your critique in there, regardless.
Absolutely.
So you're still being this flaming, cursing monster, and propaganda doesn't really apply to you in that sense. So that's a way to escalate things up at some point. Just people vanish or whatnot because they get too problematic and you cannot really deal with them in that way any longer. So there's certainly something going on in this. What Fromm probably would have seen that is just the power of life, trying to prevail for another day, for another whatever, under those circumstances we find ourselves in. So, in a sense, I feel he would have agreed with us on that too.
I think so. I mean, part of what we just pointed out is sort of embedded in the nature of his role as a public intellectual, because he has written on so many different topics, and he has made a point of writing in a very accessible fashion. Obviously, people will disagree with this interpretation or that interpretation, since in his books he covers everything from psychoanalysis to human nature to morality and so on and so forth. So he is a generalist and a popularizer. He played a very important role in making complex ideas accessible to people who otherwise would never have heard of those things. But the price that he paid for that to some extent was he was in some of his books a little repetitive, and sometimes he was a little sweeping. So experts will take issue with this aspect or that aspect of his analysis, but that is to be expected, right? The broader your gaze, the more you will have to generalize, and people then will say, yes, but this is too sweeping, or that is, not specific enough, or that interpretation is too narrow, and so on and so forth. But I think when it comes to Fromm's overall his overall work, he has done a marvelous job in focusing our attention on what matters. That our world needs to be reoriented toward finding a more humane way of relating to one another. We don't exist for the economy. The economy must exist for us. The fulfillment of human needs, genuine human needs, is what should matter. I can hear sirens in the background.
Perfect.
So, yes, so
Sirens going off in the background, just as you said
yes,
that. I mean,
we live in very dangerous times, and that is, the moment when we have to remember, what we should aim for: the building of a more humane society, a society of justice, a society of fairness, a society of humanity, and a society of sustainability. And taking our own ideas and ideals seriously. Either we believe in the equality of all, or we don't. And if we believe in that, then what does that mean in terms of the socioeconomic and the political system and the principles we should support? And I think Fromm writes about these issues with great clarity. And that is why his books remain relevant, even though if this or that aspect is perhaps outdated or somewhat problematic or too sweeping, his overall perspective is very relevant and very important to our world today.
excellent. So, would you be around for a bit longer so we can do a little Zoom call? Maybe someone is going to call in, wants to join the convo. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah.
I would be delighted to do that.
Then thanks again. Glad you are on the show. See you again.